Tonight's program is part of the Critic and Artist Residency series at Colorado State, a program that began in 1997 to bring prominent artists and critics to our campus. The program is made possible by the fund at CSU. The fund has also provided critical support for the Innovators exhibition. In addition to the fund, I would like to thank Colorado Creative Industries and the Lilla B. Morgan Memorial Fund for helping us to bring this extraordinary exhibition to CSU. I also have the privilege this evening of introducing my colleague, Tom Lundberg. Tom will introduce our special guest tonight and some special guests who are with us in the audience. Tom Lundberg is currently Professor of Art and head of the Fibers program in the Department of Art, a position that he has held since 1979. We are especially grateful to him for bringing the proposal for Innovators and Legends to our attention some 3 years ago. A very accomplished artist, Tom's work is included in the exhibition, as is the work of a number of his former graduate students. In fact, of the 50 artists represented in the exhibition, 8 have ties to CSU and Fort Collins. This fact attests to the strength and importance of our fiber program, the result of Tom's hard work and influence. So will you please join me in welcoming Professor Tom Lundberg.
Thank you very much, Lenny. Welcome, everyone. We're very glad you can be with us today. I would like to especially welcome many of you who have come from a distance. We have guests tonight, friends of the department from Community College of Aurora and from Colorado College in Colorado Springs. We're glad that all of you near and far are here tonight. I join Lenny in inviting everyone to the museum after Mark's talk. As you view the 70 artworks in our 3 galleries, you might get a sense of the installation challenges that were so skillfully met by our museum staff and volunteers. My sincere thanks to Lenny Frickman and to Keith Yench, the museum's coordinator of programs and exhibitions, and to their team for the energy and enthusiasm that they have poured into this exhibition and its related programs. After tonight's events, our next museum feature will be this Wednesday afternoon at 4 p.m., when Mark will offer a gallery talk in the museum. We invite you to join us then. The curator of our exhibition is Michigan artist Gary Jones. He lives in Grand Rapids. Several years ago, Gary was a visiting artist here in the Department of Art, along with his friend and Colorado collaborator, David Johnson. David is a Colorado weaver who studied at CSU in the 1970s. A few of the Colorado artists that Gary Jones selected for this exhibition are in our audience this afternoon. During the reception, I hope that you can meet Carol Shin, who lives here in Fort Collins, and CSU alumni Amy Clark Moore and Sarah Rockinger. We're happy that these 3 artists can be with us today, and we invite you to their gallery talks on February 26th and March 26th. Some of you may have first seen the art of tonight's guest speaker in other Colorado exhibitions. Mark Newport's work has been on view at the Ruhl Gallery in Denver, at the Loveland Museum in an exhibition called Men of the Cloth, and in a show at the Fort Collins Lincoln Center called Loose Ends. As you might know, Mark works in sculpture, mixed media, and video, and is well known for his beaded sports hero trading cards, his quilts constructed of comic books, and his costumes for superheroes. In these unlikely full-body sweaters, Mark knits together ideas about masculinity, protection, and vulnerability. His works have received attention in Art in America, the New Art Examiner, and the Chicago Sun-Times, among others, and are in collections of the Whitney Museum of American Art, New York, Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C., and the Detroit Institute of Arts, also among others. Mark received his BFA from the Kansas City Art Institute and his MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He is taught at Western Washington University in Bellingham, at Arizona State University as well. Since 2007, Mark has been artist in residence and head of the fiber program at Cranbrook Academy of Art, the well-known graduate program in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. It's a privilege to have him with us this week and for tonight's program. Please join me in welcoming Mark Newport.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you very much to Linny and Keith for all the work they did with the show and to get me here and to organize this. And Tom and Kay in the fiber department have been really fantastic today. I'm really excited to be here. I love coming to Colorado and love having great friends like Tom around to do these things with. So tonight, I'm going to talk about my work. I'm going to focus mostly on work from 2003, but I'm going to give a little preamble before that. And instead of sort of going through the work chronologically, what I want to do is talk about how things developed. So you'll get kind of a background about the work in general, you'll get a background about the costumes, and then I'm going to talk about a couple of ways ideas sort of worked through the work to talk about specific things, and then I'll show you new stuff. So you already know all that, and Tom talked about a whole lot of stuff, which makes me think I should make the talk a lot shorter. But we'll try not to do that. That would be rude. So background stuff. I grew up in Western Massachusetts of a family of computer programmers and accountants and farmers. I was not supposed to be an artist. I think that's a story many of you may know if you're artists, and so we just roll with it as an accepted thing. As I've worked through my time going to art school and then teaching and doing my work, some of the things I've grown to love are not the things that I necessarily always find in museums, even though I can remember seeing my first Ann Wilson piece in a show when I was an undergrad and thinking, I want to make work like that. I want to be that smart. Or seeing a Francis Bacon painting and being like, yes, I want to be that visceral. Those are two things that are kind of hard to put together. More recently, the stuff that I find outside of the museum, like outsider art environments on your left in Foyle, Oklahoma, the Totem Pole Park, which was made in the 1930s by a guy who wanted to make a stop along Route 66 for people to stop and see. And we all know there were totem poles made of concrete in Oklahoma. That's their native place. So I'm really interested in these projects of passion is the way I would talk about it, way I think of it, where somebody takes on this mammoth, gigantic thing. They don't necessarily think it's art. They just think it's the right thing to do, and it shows sort of their cultural interests and their personal interests. On the right, you've got an installation from a man in Cuba, in Havana, called Fuster. That's it. Almost messed that one up. And he basically took over this whole neighborhood. He started with his house and then took over this whole neighborhood, building these concrete structures and putting mosaic all over them. And particularly in Cuba, where what we always hear about is this lack of freedom and this kind of social restriction, to see something like this and see how he worked through different topics of identity and nationality, pride, and then weird surrealist forms that I didn't show you a slide of. It was engaging, and all of these things, I've spent a lot of time actually looking at these projects that happen outside of museums, and I think the thing that they help me most understand is how to maintain the intensity of being an artist. I think a lot of times life in general can get in the way of us being artists, whether it's our jobs or health or family or those kinds of things. And to see something like this that somebody takes on and works on for so many years just makes me realize, oh, it's not so hard to knit that costume for 2 months or to get ready for that show next year. That's okay. So with that as a kind of background, another one of those things, and this is a recent thing, and I shared it with the students today in class. Last year, I got to go see the Mardi Gras Indians parade on what they call Super Sunday in New Orleans. And first of all, it's a tradition I sort of knew about, but not much. But you've got costuming, you've got beadwork, you've got people dancing, a whole public spectacle, weird cultural things of African American slave history and Native Americans. It's just so rich with so many interesting things, and that somebody spends a year working on these costumes that then they're going to change next year to make a better one. and that it's competitive. My group might be better than yours, and I can dance and bead better than you. Like, what a great fiber thing to say. Yeah, that's how I throw down. That's what I do. Fiber is the coolest. Like, so that's pretty great. Okay. I've warmed everything up. My nerves are a little past, and here we go. See, Lenny didn't believe that I get nervous, but that's how you deal with it. All right, so my work. Since 2003, I have focused on these life-size and larger hand-knit superhero costumes. These two are in the show at the museum. You got Batman 3 on your left, and you've got Sweater Man number 7 on your right. Basically, the costumes fall into two groups. There are those that are recreations of real heroes. By real, we mean the ones that you can find in comic books and films, at least so far. And then the invented or my created ones are people like Sweater Man and other folks that you'll hear about later on that allow me to explore the knitting and traditions of knitting a little more and maybe get to my equivalent of the Mardi Gras Indians. This is me sort of representing and saying, yeah, knitting, I'm a hero. So you've got those two things. How did I get there? Well, Tom mentioned beaded trading cards, and so we're jumping back to 1995-ish. And I was a few years out of graduate school, and I had finished sort of my first body of work, which I am not showing you tonight because I'm allowed to edit. And it was abstract sculptural work, very much related to the body and gender. Gender has been something that has stayed in the work forever, or for my ever. And so that's a common interest. I was teaching when I started these in Kansas City, and I was hired to teach junior level students and take them through a whole range of fiber things, everything from 3D fiber stuff like basketry to embellishments and surface design stuff. And the main theme I hammer at my undergrads when I have them about with fiber is that your materials can help support and provide information to the ideas that you're working with through the social associations they have. So I had been looking for a way to work, and I found these trading cards that I'd collected up, and I thought, well, what if I beaded the trading cards? And why would I think that? Well, I think it because, first of all, football cards were something I collected as a kid, and they carry all this baggage of, my history, wanting to be a football player, but not weighing over 110 pounds until I was 27. So, football was going to be rough for me. And then the fetishizing of collecting, which I think a lot of artists know about, that you hoard materials, you use it as a kind of talisman for things you might aspire to or covet or just want to have around you. So the football cards operate on that, a kind of way of me thinking about how it is to become a man, how I might have been educated. But then I'm a guy who works in fiber, which most people don't think of as the most macho of things to do, although we have proven earlier that it is. So taking the beads, which would be a traditional material that might come from, say, decoration, come from evening gowns that women might wear when they're at their most feminine, and putting them on the football players who are decked out in their most masculine is a way of embodying critiques about, or contradictions about gender that I'm intrigued in, those places where our ideas about what men and women are supposed to be don't quite fit, and making them manifest in this object, and maybe doing it with a sense of humor so that people don't immediately get freaked out that you're challenging their ideas about gender, but they can laugh a little and then say, I don't like that idea, that bothers me, which is what my brother does every time I offer him a Dan Marino trading card. He went into the military. I went to art school. We're different. So the trading cards were about a 2 or 3 year period where I was using this idea of transformation, and it grew into another idea where the act of sewing the beads onto the trading cards, whether it was football players like these or whether it was pinup cards, it was all a way of me sort of meditating or embodying a meditation on a thing that you might have used to learn about how you would become an adult male in this case, and then question it and form a relationship between all these images you would see and all this labor of belief through the meditating. Now, like I said, that lasted for a couple of years, and eventually even I ran out of trading cards. And I started thinking about what were other pop culture objects, because I'm really interested in how pop culture feeds us ideas. Whether it's meant as entertainment or not, it gives us a reflection of what some of the values of our culture might be and what we might want to aspire to. And comic books were one of those things that I didn't collect like trading cards, but that I was aware of and bought when I was a kid because I loved to draw the superheroes when I was a kid. It was actually sort of how I learned to draw and learned anatomy, which is not a good way to learn anatomy, but you know. So I started thinking about comic books and spent a year or so actually while I was working on the cards trying to figure out what I could do with the comic books to get at some of those ideas and make the transformation, because I was interested in, again, in that transformation of the textile merged with this transient sort of not valuable pop culture material, and how that changed our expectations, even how putting something that we usually think of as pulp, basically, into the art world changed our expectations. And I started making two different groups of work with these. The first that I'll show you is this sampler called Sampler number 619, Batman. And this is actually a comic book cover that was 3 comic book covers wide that opened up. It was a fold out. So it was sort of like the centerfold in Playboy, only it was the cover for Batman. And it had all the heroes and villains of this particular story right there on the cover when it folded out. And I had mentioned Sampler. Sampler is a tradition I was borrowing in this case as a reference point from 1800s America and England, where you would teach a young woman to learn how to sew and embroider by doing these samplers where you would have text and you would have different stitches. And you've probably seen pictures, you know, little pictures of houses and things like that. And so on the one hand, I was taking that as a way of thinking, how would you teach a man to embroider in 2000 or 1999? And how does that then reflect our expectations? Because if you do some research into feminist writing about embroidery and textiles and samplers in particular, a lot of writing focuses on the idea of the expectations for a woman at that time was to be quiet, be domestic, be polite. If you're sitting embroidering, chances are you're not out yelling on a city square, so you're learning all that. Those aren't things we always teach our boys. Lately we drug them, give them, you know, drugs to be quiet. But what if we did teach them embroidery? How does that change our expectations? So this one is one of the later pieces. You can see Catwoman on the right and Batman on the left, and they are embroidered with the color patterns of the actual image as a way of making them the prominent characters, and then the other background characters are there as ghosts or shadows in this gray other stitch. And the idea was to talk about sort of the prominence of the narrative, who are the main protagonists, and how do they relate to how we understand male and female. The other group of work that I made from these, and was actually the first group of work, was a series of bed covers or quilts. And actually, one of these was in that show in Loveland that Tom talked about. And they're made completely out of comic book pages and embroidery, and then satin blanket ribbon like you might have had on your favorite blankie when you were a kid. And I would choose, I did about a half dozen of these. I would choose the comic books based on different specific themes in the images. And so either the heroes would be, like in this one, the very first one, all of the heroes I remember reading. Some of them would be just Batman and Catwoman, because it was sort of thinking about what are your first relationships like. Another one was all red, white, and blue heroes, which isn't hard to find because lots of them are red, white, and blue. And thinking about patriotism. And the bed cover became a way of referencing a historic tradition again, of freedom quilts, which were made by the women of a family and given to the young man of a family when he gained his economic independence from his father at his 21st birthday. Again, late colonial America. And so I was interested in that. My pieces then sort of took on the same function as those pieces in a way of saying, here, we're still making a connection to you as you move out and as you become an adult. We're giving you something that protects you, keeps you warm, but then my object goes one step further and it doesn't actually protect you or keep you warm. The images are kind of hollow images of masculinity and femininity, and the paper is going to fall apart because it's the worst kind of paper on earth. And eventually, I hope none of my collectors are out here. Eventually, it'll just be a pile of little French knot embroidery stitches in the bottom of some vitrine with paper dust. That's bad. Shouldn't tell that to people that collect art. Here's a detail of the embroidery on there. All of these pieces had areas embroidered that pointed out certain things, like the one that was patriotic had 50 Captain Americas in the corner all embroidered, so it was like the 50 stars of the flag. This one's got the villains and the hero in danger, which again is low fruit to pick in a comic book. It's pretty easy to find. And then also, and I don't have a good slide of this, my full name was embroidered on them along with my 21st birth date for most of them. And that was a way of reflecting the tradition and paying a connection back to that and re-emphasizing that I was kind of making this tradition for me or for men my age and thinking about that transition to adulthood and how these different moments come about, how textiles mark that, and how we understand who we're supposed to be. And this is actually the first place where protection starts to come into the work. And that's what sort of leads to the costumes. Now, little segue, this is not mine in any way. A curator friend gave me this Manly Art of Knitting book. I would love to say this is how I learned to knit because that would just make life so perfect, wouldn't it? But I did not. This came later. Almost as perfect. My grandmother taught me to knit when I was a kid. My grandmother was a first grade school teacher when I was growing up. And she was a very smart woman who had 7 kids who then had many, many grandkids for her. And those grandkids would come and visit her in the summer like me. And my brother and I could do a lot of damage in a grandparent's house if left to our own devices, playing baseball indoors or other things like that. So any way she could support our creative endeavors, she did. So she got me my first painting kit. She got me embroidery kits and string art kits. Yes, I made those great choo-choo trains with the nails and the string. And she taught me to knit one day when I said, I want to learn to knit. She didn't show me actually how to start. She just said, here's the stitches. I'll start it for you. Here you go. So fast forward 30 years later, around 2000, I wanted to add knitting to my repertoire of a 3D fibers class. And I realized that I could remember what the stitches were, but I didn't know how you got to them. And so my wife is a knitter, and she said, here, this is how you do it. She got me started, and then she said, take the Learn to Knit book and leave me alone, because I'm one of those students that will just keep asking you questions. And so the Manly Art of Knitting would be a nice one, but it was actually my wife and my grandmother. And the costumes started about 3 years after I relearned to knit. They were an outgrowth of those comic book pieces and ideas of protection. They were also what is pretty typical in my work, a moment of intersection between something personal happening and something in the world happening. And in this instance, what I mean is, it was 2003 when I started them. I was living in Arizona. It's a couple years after 9/11. There was still lots of talk in the news about we have to protect the border in Arizona from the terrorists coming over the border. How are they going to get to us? I remember my father-in-law, who lives in Springfield, Missouri, was certain that somebody was going to fly a plane into downtown Springfield. There was just lots of tension. And at the same time, my daughter, who is now in college and would be horrified to hear me talk about her in public, was at the age, she was about 6 or 7, where we would let her go off and ride her bike to her friend's house or go to the park around the corner. And I had these moments of anxiety attack, which reveals that I'm kind of OCD, that like I couldn't take care of her if I couldn't see her. And how do I deal with that? And that was quite natural in most cases. If you're going to have children, you've got to make sure they live, you've got to take care of them. But on the other hand, I'm this artist guy who's kind of left to center and cool and researches gender, so I shouldn't be falling into these traps about traditional gender behavior, right? That's the conversation in my head. So how do I deal with that? How do I protect people? And who does protect people became the questions. And I thought, well, superheroes, that's who protects people. How do you become a superhero? Well, that's easy. I'm a fiber guy. Of course, you make a costume. That's how you know you're a superhero. You have a special uniform. So I started making the costumes for my size. These two aren't actually good examples of that, but we'll get to what they are examples of. And the first ones were recreations of real heroes. So I started with Batman. This one's actually Big Batman. He's 10 feet tall instead of my size. But I started with those real heroes, and I wanted to use the knitting because the knitting seemed like the appropriate textile for a superhero costume. It would stretch and move with you, and it's a sweater, so it protects you. You're getting that my logic serves its own purposes as it needs to. Most of the costumes button up the back, so they are completely wearable, and they were made, for the most part, to fit me. Pretty quickly, I started making my own heroes, and those heroes were a place of taking the knitting, which on its own contradicts the idea of the hero. You know, if you're going to spend 2 months knitting a costume that you're going to wear to fight people in, you're spending 2 months not fighting to make the costume to be the superhero. And it doesn't actually make you look particularly superhero-esque. It's kind of like a sweater. It looks kind of slubby and pathetic and all that, even at 10 feet tall. So, you know, the other heroes, the ones where I was using like Sweater Man and that kind of thing, or Big S Man as this one is, were all about showing off my knitting chops. Because the ones that were recreations of real heroes were pretty straightforward, simple knitting. But these, I could dress them up with cables and do all sorts of knitting tradition references and have fun with the knitting and really push that out there to say, okay, if the hero can be made out of knit, can the knitting be the emblem of his power? So on the left, you've got Big Batman, and on the right, you've got Big S-Man. Big Batman is 10 feet tall, Big S-Man is about 8 feet tall, and they come from one of my more recent series where I was using scale, getting away from the scale of me as the wearer, but thinking about scale of the costume as the imposing thing that makes you think this is heroic. Even though most of the costumes at one time or another hang in galleries, either in space or on the wall like they are in the museum, and they're kind of droopy, and they're kind of sad and empty and pathetic and not super muscular and active, and that's all intentional. I want those contradictions to come through in the piece and make you sort of deal with the questions that hopefully raises. So another real hero and not real hero, we got Spider-Man on the left and Sweater-Man number 4 on the right, because if one Sweater-Man is good, 7 or 8 or 9 of them are better. Spider-Man is one of those places where early on I was starting to mess with the knitting. Generally speaking, when you make a sweater, and I make these all in one piece, they start at the shoulders, they work down, the arms grow out, the head grows up, voila, it's a costume. Generally when you'd make a sweater, you would be tapering from the shoulders or from the armpits down to the waist because your shoulders are generally wider than your hips. And I was looking at Spider-Man when I was making him and thinking, well, what if I didn't? What if he just went straight from the shoulders down and gave me a little more room, because I'm not a teenager like Spider-Man. I'm a little more middle-aged and not quite as svelte as I was when I was 20. What does that say about the hero? He gets a little bit pudgier, more pathetic. I like that. He's also doesn't have the black lines. The knitting actually gives him the texture of the black lines of the web. So each thing plays up what the knitting can do a little more and what the costume offers. A Sweater-Man number 4, the purple and black guy, which is kind of dark there. It's lighter on my screen. Is one of those chances of really playing up what knitting can do. He's covered with these cables that actually he would be exactly the same size as Spider-Man for the most part, except that the cables make the body of the suit shrink up and torment it, so the body all of a sudden becomes kind of troubling. Is this heroic? How can it be? I mean, his head is all squished in like some kind of cone head from Saturday Night Live, and he becomes kind of menacing and non-threatening all at the same time. Sometimes the world just gives you great opportunities, which is an odd transition to make when I throw up new slides, but I get my yarn. I get the cheapest acrylic yarn on earth at Joann's and Michael's. I get Red Heart acrylic yarn. For anybody who's a real fiber aficionado, they're all going, Why would you do that? And I've had knitting groups come to my shows and be like, you can get better acrylic yarn. But I get this acrylic yarn because in the rare instances my single mom had time to do things when she wasn't working a couple jobs when I was a kid or going to college. She got her bachelor's degree when I was growing up. She got it when I was 16 and then went off to graduate school. She would knit us sweaters, my brother and I, and she would buy acrylic yarn because she's a woman of the modern era and you don't have to dry clean or iron things that are made out of plastic. Right? So a red heart acrylic yarn was what she would use. And it's this body of work is actually one of the few times where my mom and I can sit down and she doesn't say, explain this to me, which is okay because she means it in a very sort of open, curious way, almost akin to how the heck did this happen? Meaning me, the artist. But she'll look at the pieces I'm making and goes like, I really liked cables too, Mark. What are you doing there with that cable? And we have these knitting talks that we never would have had if I had gone into sculpture or photo, right? So there's this other thing. Now, that's a long way of saying, look, at Joann's, they still make the same colors of yarn in the Red Heart thing, and they also make like big purple guy here on the left, whose name I can't quite remember. I think he's Big S-Man 3. They make variegated yarn, which means like 2 or 3 colors on one strand, and all this purple stuff is all there, except for the solid purple areas, all on one strand of yarn. And I look at that stuff and I think, why does somebody think that's going to be attractive, first of all? Second, what would that look like 10 feet tall and around a body? That can only be good. So I have in addition to my pop culture love of cheap things and kind of crazy aesthetics, whenever Red Heart comes out with a new variegated yarn, you can be sure that I have looked at it very closely. I've got one that's red, white, and blue. It's a hero called the Patriot that I invented because everybody knows the flag should be looking sort of like that in red, white, and blue on a body. All right. The other thing that Red Heart did was they made spirit yarn. And since this is the day after the Super Bowl, we can talk about our beat-up spirits now. But they made these 2-color yarns where instead of it ending up mixing, it's going to end up making stripes. And the 2 colors are always sports team colors. So you've got Denver Bronco colors, you've got Green Bay Packer colors, you've got Dallas Cowboy colors, and there's probably some college teams in there that I am unaware of because I went to art school instead of a university. So on the right, you've got the first of Spirit Man. And Spirit Man is basically me playing up their idea to be embodying some kind of quality of association, of communal behavior, of something that we use to bond with each other and give us a quality of feeling together in a way that we wouldn't on our own. And then make it into my version of Barnett Newman or Sean Scully or Ellsworth Kelly stripe paintings, because I think they would really love to be on a superhero costume. So this is the first one, and it was sort of every sport team color of every city I had lived in for like 10 years, which just goes to show that I move too much. So that's sort of how the costumes work. I respond to personal stuff like the knitting and my mom. I respond to social stuff like being in Arizona, the border, trying to think about protection. Now, what I want to talk about a little is how, it's sort of 2 things at once. How I went from static objects on a gallery wall, which is how I prefer to live as an artist because performing and being in front of people is absolutely frightening to me, and how some of those stories and ideas about the superheroes come about. So we're going to start with this costume, which is the Rawhide Kid. And the Rawhide Kid was an actual real comic book hero, for those of you that aren't comic book geeks, from the 50s up to the 70s or 80s. And he was a cowboy, which for me, a kid from New England, that was as enticing a role as Batman was. And Batman's pretty much my favorite superhero, so that's saying a lot. To dream, to move out here, to be in the Wild West, which I know doesn't exist anymore, although Arizona's trying. And to have that, all the myth of what a superhero is all based in the idea of the cowboy, the independence, the vigilantism, the sort of pull yourself up by your bootstrap stuff. So I made Rawhide Kid, A, because I wanted to be a cowboy as much as I wanted to be Batman or a football player, and B, because he was the perfect nexus of mythology and real life. My cowboy, of course, doesn't have guns because I don't like guns. I'm a pacifist. I probably should have put knitting needles in his holsters, but I didn't. His hat is slightly different because I couldn't really go all the way and wear a cowboy hat if I was going to be a superhero. That just seemed a little too cliche. So he's got a stocking cap with the little ties that would go around his neck. And then his gloves, which you can sort of see there, hang from a string that goes up through. So it's like when you were a kid and you would lose your mittens. Just, you don't want to lose your gloves when you're being a cowboy. Now, okay, before I jump right in. So the cowboy is there as that mythological thing. If I could have been a Native American, and this sounds particularly racist, I don't mean it to, I probably would have aspired to be that when I was a kid, but I did learn enough to know that that was dependent on my parents. So, this mythology of the West, Native Americans, cowboys, was sort of wrapped up a lot in visiting the art museum at certain times, not just watching Western movies, but the Clark Art Institute, where I went to art trips when I was growing up and going to public school, had this great collection of Remington paintings and sculptures. And I just adored those things. They are the worst cliche of art on earth, next to the other stuff I like, which is post-romantic salon paintings. So this painting, the Frederick Remington, the Scout, was something that came back into mind after I made the Rawhide Kid, and was one of the first keys for me to think about how I could take these things off of the gallery wall and make them be part of a performance, which was something I wanted to do for a couple reasons. First of all, the work suggested it, and I'm a big believer in learning from your work, so that I was making costumes, that they were wearable and fit me, all seemed to point to some kind of idea of performance or action in them, even though I didn't really want to add to the tradition of bad performance art. And I needed to find a way in the studio to figure out how to make that work. So I thought about this painting and thought, the Rawhide Kid could protect people on horseback in the desert in Arizona. So here I am in May in Arizona, wearing a full-body plastic costume, riding Tinkerbell, in my version of the Scout, and I'm looking over the highway, which is the 202 highway for anybody that's lived in Scottsdale or Phoenix, and the little white sign that's sort of a quarter of the way from the left is actually the Casino Arizona, which is one of the big casinos in the area, and they had just wiped out this whole field that had sagebrush and other stuff in it and made it empty and sort of barren. And I was really interested in how I might recast this. You'll note that this is backwards from the other image. In my mind, I did the photo before I did the research and remembered what the actual image was. So in my mind, the Scout actually points the other direction. Remington just got it wrong. The thing about I did several of these photos, and the photos were great for me to start to think about how do my characters live in the world? How do they fight? How do they interact? How do they prepare to do their job to be protective? Problem with them was they required a lot of work. I needed either excellent Photoshop skills, which I didn't have, and a much better camera, or better assistance. And that sounds bad because my family was my assistants. My daughter's the horseback rider. She made sure that Tinkerbell the horse wasn't going to take off. My wife shot the picture, and I had given her directions and told her where to stand and stuff, and she knows photography, so that was safe. But then we had one more member of the family that we had to account for, and either we had to get a babysitter for the 2-year-old boy, or he had to come along. So he came along, and he loved to go to the barn and watch his sister ride. He also loved to feed the horses anything he could find. So in the front of where this photo stops, imagine a blanket on the ground, and that was where I could change in and out of the costume without it getting dirty. Well, my son decided that he was going to feed the horse some of the dead grass, and he waited until the horse was by the blanket and I was getting off of it in the costume to throw the grass at the horse and at me and on the blanket. The piece had to be at a show the next month, and I picked grass off of that thing for the whole month, and the curator still said, there's still grass on the piece, Mark. Museum people don't like grass on their pieces. Whoops, sorry, head up. So I needed to find a way that was quicker. Oops, that's not supposed to happen. That could give me more of a sketch idea of some of these ideas and make them happen quicker and easier. So I started a series of digital prints that I got a grant for from the Creative Capital Foundation in 2005 to start exploring how do my heroes work. So here's a variation of that image with me and Tinkerbell facing the Mexican-American border. And you can see the Statue of Liberty off on your left. And you see these toothbrushes. The toothbrushes were a reference that came from a public radio story I heard where the border agents were tracking immigrants as they came across the border. And one of the things they would find repeatedly were personal items that the people had to get rid of because they couldn't carry them anymore. And one of the things they mentioned was toothbrushes. And so I imagined it like this trail of toothbrushes that the heroes could follow to find these people. Whoops, I keep hitting the wrong button all of a sudden. There we go. I was also thinking more realistically, like how does the hero get in his suit? And even with years of yoga, I can't reach my arms quite back to all the buttons. So this is my wife, who I told her only her hands would be in the print, helping me get ready to go out and fight with the kids' toys around, and the shadows of us become much more ominous than the actual hero. Or maybe I'm sitting there knitting and that's how I fight. That everything happens around me and that the sound of knitting, which is sk, sk, as in the stuff surrounding me there in the costume, is what's helping fight. And of course, wood is like a comic book thing I ripped off completely as this figure flies through the air because I'm beating him to a pulp with my knitting. Other happy accident is that sk, sk, SSSK is almost like a knitting abbreviation for slipping stitches off of needles to change the size of the knitting. So like, yeah. And this sounds like I'm insane and that this would never lead to being into performance, but you will see. There's another one part of this though. Besides the Remington painting, this is not a painting I saw in museums, but when I was in grad school, I had to take a textile art history class. And my teacher was talking about these paintings. It was meant to be a survey class. These paintings by, nuts, I'm forgetting her name. It'll come back. Huh? Did somebody know? No. Yes, Judith Leister, thank you. Art historians rock. All right, Judith Leister, who, Northern Renaissance woman painter, who did these series of paintings of women in public spaces doing textile work as a way to fend off the advances of lecherous, nasty, drunken men. And I thought, what a great superpower. It's like fiber representing again, only it's got this added layer of the process is actually making the power. Maybe there's like a force field there, which then made me think about my grandmother, the one that taught me knitting. You can imagine if even just half of your kids show up with half of their kids, when you've got 7 already and each of them has reproduced at least 2 or 3 times, that's a lot of people in the farmhouse. And that many young kids is a lot of energy. But my grandmother, after she got dinner done and cleaned up, would sit on the couch, no matter what we were doing, and do craft work. And she was just as happy as a clam, even if we were breaking her lamps, because she was doing that. So it was like she was in this bubble. So one of the questions that I always get, and that was sort of important in thinking about how to make the transition from objects to performance, was, what's your superhero's power? Sweater Man has to have a superpower, right? So Sweater Man's superpower became this idea of the knitting generating a force field. So here's Sweater Man's vulnerable alter ego, naked, because we always have our worst nightmares naked, with a little bit of flash of maybe there's a force field coming out of there. And then here he is in costume, making a bigger force field with a little bit of comic book help and these digital prints of, he knew that if he could just finish this, he could help. And that goes back, that text sort of playing up the idea of comic book reference, playing up the idea that whenever you're involved in making your work and somebody comes up and says, can you answer this question or can you help me? You say, hold on, I've got to finish this row. And then you never finish the row, you just keep going, right? So you're not actually protecting, and I like that idea of contradicting myself. So it did lead to performance. Honest. This is a clip from, or 2 stills from a performance I did in Texas at a show called Unknitting. And the performances became a 3-part kind of thing. First, I would come in and I would patrol the space I was in like I was a gallery guard, and I would stop by doors and I would stand there and be silent like the guys at Buckingham Palace and just look at people. And then I would eventually sit down and start knitting in costume to make sure that I generated the force field to protect the people in the art. Of course, nobody knows that's why I'm knitting. That's my mythology. But I'm obviously doing something important. These 2 ladies there, they obviously think it's important and kind of curious. And then at the end, after I'm done knitting, and I decide ahead, is it going to be 300? Is it going to be 20, whatever it is? Then I walk out, and as I'm walking out, I give one hand-knit mitten to somebody who probably wasn't paying attention to me, and I tell them, this is for you, this may protect you. And it's the only thing I say the whole time, and then the rest, as I'm walking out, the rest of the people get these IOUs, like in the bottom image. And it says, IOU, one protective gesture, sweater man, and whatever the date is. And it's meant to, again, bring back the idea, just like the single mitten, that it should protect you, but it can't. But I'm trying. And so, there's an earnestness and a sarcasm all at the same time. So, and that led to a video because live performance is actually horrifying. You can't trust the audience to do what you want them to do. They're completely unruly and poke at you and ask you questions, and sometimes they get drunk. And so video seemed like a much better way to embody that. And so this is a still from a video called Heroic Efforts, which you can see on my website if you want. And it's me in a rocking chair, 2 different views, front view, side view, sometimes back far away, sometimes up close. And I'm knitting to the strains of the William Tell Overture. And for some of you, you'll know that was the theme to the Lone Ranger, which, me being heroic, I don't rock much. Every now and again when the music gets going, there might be a little gentle rock, but I'm really focusing on the knitting. And it's meant to be cyclical so that it goes for 3.5 minutes, and then it happens again and again and again, and it's like perpetual trying to save the world through knitting and not being able to do it. But the music makes you really tense when you listen to it because it's just so upbeat and so dynamic. Okay, so performance happened. And this is a little segue to make sure I check my time. Okay, I better wrap up. So some of the work relates to body image, and I see that we're close towards 6, and people want to ask questions, so I'm going to kind of go through this quickly. Meaning in the costumes that I can make the costume any size I want. This is Bobble Man. First of all, I realized that my legs aren't very long in comparison to my torso, and I wanted to be the Western ideal like everybody else. So I made Bobble Man's legs longer, and I covered him with these bobble stitches or popcorn stitches, which was kind of a reference to what if the body goes wrong and erupts through your costume, or what if your power is actually embraced in those. There's a tradition of shamanic garments from Africa and Indonesia where they wear their magical packets on their garments, so maybe that's where my superpower comes from. Or maybe you make a costume because the shoulders start it and define everything, where the shoulders just get way bigger than you really are. And so you can aspire to be this massive football player-sized guy. Related to the costumes, and for the last couple of years I've been carving these figures, which then get their own costumes. They are meant to be, they're 16 inches tall. They're like action figures, like the G.I. Joes I used to play with, only they're carved out of basswood and they're posable. And they're anything but heroic looking. So this guy who is an homage to the guys that used to hang out in Chicago with their shirts rolled up over their bellies. This one where obviously the torso is much smaller than the bottom end. And there's suggestions that maybe there's stuff in the bottom end that doesn't go along with the top end, and playing up gender and sexuality there. Yeah. And then real quick, through doing all of this, because occasionally I'll knit in public by accident, like on airplanes, because I can't sit still very long without doing something functional. So Pee-wee is here to remind me that we're always in costume. So what if your costume is a guy at a football game knitting? Or what if your costume is being a cowboy dreaming of the Marlboro Man while you're knitting on your trusty steed? And yeah, this isn't an everyday costume for most people, but what if your costume is being a rock musician and you'd rather knit backstage than play your instrument? So that was a series of pieces where I was sort of playing up the fact that even still, and I'm always surprised by this, in 2014, people get a little weirded out that a guy might be knitting. And so I wanted to sort of make these images that poke back at that and say, yeah, and Gene Simmons does it too, so get over it. Which then segues more into our part of rock stars and scars of this talk. Most recent work I've been doing, along with a few costumes still, is embroidered pieces that take record covers and posters and translate them into embroidery by embroidering the backgrounds, not the foregrounds, so not the people usually. And then the actual substrate that I'm embroidering on is cloth, of all things, not paper or something like that, but the cloth I'm choosing makes reference to the particular subculture that might enjoy that music. So this is a fake pleathery kind of material, black leather, like a black leather jacket, or like the stuff that Kiss would wear, and this is the Destroyer album, which I had when I was a kid. Flannel, Nirvana Nevermind. Actually doing a whole series of these in different color flannels because I realized that flannel could make great optic effects with the water coming over it. And then this is a kind of awkward slide, but this is the scars part of things. Along with these, because I'm thinking about how the embroidery mimics a kind of skin, how it is the overall identity we see, and that skin is kind of a record of our experiences in some ways. I've been embroidering interpretations of scars on my body and making these small-scale embroideries that are very kind of minimal, but use a stitch that looks a lot like the pores on my skin and the wrinkles, and sort of paying homage to those moments of vulnerability or kind of experience, I guess is the way to put it. And they're on muslin, and they're very much taking the muslin as a skin and then putting the scar over it as a skin and thinking about the act of sewing as a piercing or a kind of reference to healing and to damage all at the same time. So here's another one. They're a little hard to photograph, so I'm trying to work on that. And then Mardi Gras Indian to say goodbye and thank you, and if you have any questions, we can do that. Thanks a lot. All right. I don't know how this question thing works here, and I can only see you guys a little. Oh, that's a little better. There's somebody waving a microphone. Oh, yeah, please use the microphone.
So
they appreciate that.
the people that you gave the IOUs to, did you ever give them?
I have not heard from them. I always wondered if there would be an email through my website or something, but nobody did. The only one that I know of that exists in the world that I see regularly is my wife managed to get one at one of my performances in Michigan, and she kept it on our dresser. And occasionally I wonder if, that's going to get used. And then I kind of worry about how. Oh, there's somebody.
I'm really interested in the thematic focus that you have with your art, and I wondered if you could talk about how you see that as important, or as opposed to just totally random things, which tends to be what I do.
The thematic thing, it's important to me because it's something that's, since I actually was finishing undergrad, has always been something I've been, the idea of gender and how we relate to that is something I've always been interested in, and it's always become manifest in the work. Also, save for one or two groups of work, the mix of popular culture and textile work is something that's always been a part of the things. And on the one hand, I think it happens. Sometimes I describe it as I was sort of primed to have to deal with this. And by that, what I mean is my parents divorced when I was young, and my mom, and it was the 70s, so my mom was very much a feminist, but not. Like, she didn't want them to change and write the Equal Rights Amendment, but she believed that as a woman, she could do anything that any man could do, and she could do it better, and my brother and I better well understand that. But we should open the door for our dates and treat them special, and that they were sensitive and soft, right? So that, and then my dad was very much a kind of strong, silent type kind of guy, not particularly macho because he's built like me and we don't get to pull that off, but you know, he was not one of those in touch with your feelings, follow your bliss kind of people. So I think in a way I was sort of seeing the contradictions of gender long before I understood what that might mean or why that would be interesting to explore, and then to not fall into textile production or fiber when I was an undergrad, but sort of get into that, not intentionally, became another opportunity because it's a field that is predominantly thought of as related to women. And many of the teachers I had were these amazingly intelligent, strong feminist women that in different ways really were able to say, don't screw with that, you know, and put out certain ideas. So it was just something that was always sort of playing there in my head, along with the idea that, oh yeah, I want to be a football player, which is not that at all. So yeah, and then to know that my mom and her mom, my grandmother that taught me to knit, didn't worry about any of that stuff in a way. It's like, yes, be aware of this, but you can do what you want. So yeah, learn to change the oil, learn to knit, learn to embroider, learn to carve. It was all kind of open, and it just made sense. That's why it's important to me, I guess. There's somebody over there, yeah.
Is it on?
Yes.
This is sort of unfair, but in looking at gender, are you trying to be suggestive of androgyny, or are you trying to be suggestive of some transformation of both masculinity and femininity?
Yeah, that's a tricky question, right? Because when I started actually thinking about gender, androgyny was the model that a lot of thinkers and writers put out, which is kind of like embracing both and evening both out. I'm actually for something a little more complicated, which is embrace the differences, but allow them to be individual, that I don't have to be a certain thing because I was born with an XY chromosome pair, and you don't have to be something because you're a woman, that we can pick and choose, and that we shouldn't be discriminated one way or the other, I think, if that makes sense. So I want cake and eat it too. And I think we should all want cake and eat it too. Yeah, how you make that work in a social setting, I have no idea. In a structure, I saw somebody. Sorry, yeah.
All your superhero pieces are like roughly based on you, and I was just wondering, and maybe you mentioned it and I missed it during your talk, but when people go into a gallery and they see your pieces, do you sort of hope that they sort of experience themselves in the pieces and their own vulnerability and role in protection, or is it sort of a strictly personal thing for you?
I exactly hope that they could imagine themselves. Part of the reason for hanging the pieces on garment hangers, on garment hooks, is to hopefully make them seem kind of accessible, that you could imagine yourself putting them on. I realize there's certain limitations to that because they're made to be for somebody who's about 6 feet tall, and not everybody is about 6 feet tall. But I did want that sort of hope that they could imagine me, but they could also imagine themselves and taking on that role. Yeah. Oh, it's that time. Okay, thanks, Tom. One last question, yeah.
I'm going to assume that. All right. My question you brought up the kind of parenting story, and you were, talking about, with your superhero pieces, the idea of protection. But at the same time, I think there's also a maternal kind of connection that we make to that. And do you see that as an intersection with the knitting, or as an intersection at all?
That's a really good question. Nobody's asked it that way before. Good. If I was, I guess what I want to try to do is not assign a maternal or a paternal side to that, because that sort of gets into that complication of gender, but to understand that we all have these different sort of push and pulls about how we have to relate to other people, whether it's kids or students or friends, and that, again, I shouldn't have had to get hung up on that. It made some fun work. We shouldn't have to be in a situation socially where choosing one or the other or being assigned one or the other because of how we were born means that we're more or less or given more advantages or less. Yeah. So yeah, I guess that's it. And Tom says we have to stop now.
Mark and our other guest artists will be in the gallery in the museum, so if you would like to continue asking them questions, grab something to eat and drink and join us there. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks. Yeah.